And let me share my screen. And here we go. So as you all know, we have a 15-minute Q&A at the end that will be great because you'll all be able to type your questions in the chat, and I'll be able to directly engage with you guys then. But let's get into it. Critiques lecture. So first, what is a K, right? What consists of a K? What actually makes up a K? So a K can be designed in one of three ways. The first way is that you are doing something wrong, right? So that means the debater has done some conduct that represents the link into the critique. So for example, this might be you use the phrase "you guys" against a team that involved someone who is not a guy. And so now they're running a critique on you saying that you essentially need to lose because you promoted heteronormativity, and cisnormativity actually would be the right word, in the debate space, or sexism. And so that's basically what the thesis of a gendered language critique is. And so that's an instance in which the debater has committed a violation. They have done something wrong. Now, the other kind of critique is when the resolution is doing something wrong in some way. And again, this is epistemological in nature. The vast majority of critiques they have to do with language. So on the TOC resolution, I believe this was my senior year, the resolution was something along the lines of we should withdraw all of our troops from the Persian Gulf. And there was a critique that people would run that would be that would say the phrase Persian Gulf is like colonialist in origin or what have you. And that was a reason to reject the resolution and therefore to negate. So that would be one example of a critique where the resolution is doing something wrong. The next one here is that the argument is doing something bad rather than the actual resolution itself. So let's say, for example, that you're on a topic where you're running some sort of conflict scenario and you're trying to present some form of argument as to why, if we do the resolution, it'll lead to an uptick in conflict in XYZ area. Maybe it's terrorism, maybe whatever. The response to this is sometimes known as what's called a threat K, where teams will make the argument that any conflict scenario is essentially just constructed out of nothing. And all of these conflict scenarios that we model, these big wars with China and Russia and terrorist scenarios and all of that stuff, none of this stuff ever actually happens. Instead, what we're doing is we're constructing threats. And when you construct the threat, you take actions that make the threat real. So when you think China is going to attack you, you then militarize and take hostile actions that make it a lot more likely that China will then attack you. And so this is a critique where, you're basically just being like, no conflicts ever are going to happen. But this is a critique in which the argument is doing something bad according to the critiquer. And what the argument is doing is it's perpetuating myths of credible threats, of conflict, et cetera, et cetera. So overall, a critique can be delivered in one of three forms. So it can be either you are doing something wrong, you can be the resolution is doing something wrong, or the argument is doing something wrong. And these are, generally speaking, the three buckets of types of violations that critiques tend to focus on. So now let's talk about the structure of a K. Pretty simple. It's a link, it's an impact, and it's a role of the ballot. So let's talk about what each one is. So the link to the critique, it talks about why exactly you violate the principle that they're talking about. So let's say that they're running a gendered language related critique. The link would be where they establish that you have used gendered language and you have therefore engaged in the structure that the critique says is such a terrible thing. So that's basically what a link is. And this can have a lot of different forms. Sometimes the link is a little less simple than that, right? Sometimes in your link, you're again, like with the threat construction critique, you might have to make a lot more assumptions and arguments for why the other team is, like, generally speaking, perpetuating this conflict narrative and this fear, because that might not be super intuitive to the judge. But that's what a link is. It's where you connect the actions of the team or the substance of the resolution or the argument they've made to the larger structure that is being critiqued. So then you have the impact, right? The impact is where the critique explains why exactly it is such a bad thing, that this structure gets perpetuated. So maybe this is an Orientalism critique. What you need to do on the impact level is explain, why is Orientalism such a horrible thing? Why does it make the world a more violent place, a more racist place? That's where you really flesh out the impact, and where you convince the judge of the large scale, more tangible sort of harms that might come from this argument. All right. Sorry, I'm just letting someone in. Next point is the impact. Or I already said the impact. The next point is the role of the ballot. The role of the ballot is where you justify, if the rest of the critique is true, if the link and the impact is true, then why does that mean that you win? That is what the role of the ballot is meant to justify. And when this happens, the vast majority of the time, the role of the ballot will tie back to will tie back to what sort of change the debaters want to see in the debate space, or in the way that things are discussed in the debate space. One common example of a role of the ballot is to vote for the team that best interrogates this narrative, because this narrative is a prerequisite to discussing the rest of the debate. Again, on the Orientalism example, right? Orientalism is the critique in which people make the argument that scholars around much of international relations that are theorizing about US, China, et cetera, all of these scholars have substantial anti-China biases, and the West has a tradition of demonizing the East and sort of fear-mongering and assuming that they are a bigger threat than they really are. And that's the thesis of the Orientalism critique, that it's racist and it makes the world a more violent place. Now, in the role of the ballot, on a conflict topic like the Persian Gulf topic, or like another topic where China might come up, which is a lot of IR stuff, it's a lot of South China Sea stuff, so this could be quite common. One role of the ballot could be um, the team that best discusses and best understands Orientalism should win. The reason for this is that Orientalism is a prerequisite to our understanding of the entire rest of this debate, because it dictates what conflict scenarios we view as probable and according to whom we are making decisions on the reasonability of these various arguments. And the idea here is that these are all biased actors that have been influenced by these Western perceptions and misconceptions. One crucial part of the role of the ballot, some people would say this is like a separate part, but I think it's probably just the same part, is the alt. So a critique is pointing out a violation as it relates to some larger structure. But what's important is that if you affirm or negate, most critiquers will agree that this structure will exist in either world. So if you're running an identity-based critique and your argument is about racism, if you're good and know what you're doing, you're not going to like say, oh yeah, racism stops existing when you vote for us. That's not what it means. Instead, what the critique becomes is it becomes more of a symbolic endorsement of a given position. So if, say, you're running a gendered language critique, the alt might be, you should reject the team that uses gendered language to set to help create a safe debate environment. And so that alt establishes a clear distinction between the team running the critique and what voting for that team actually represents, and what voting for the other team represents. And we'll get a little bit more into that in a second. And then we'll get more into the meat of these critiques. So let's talk about the types of alts. Two types: utopian alts and reject alts, right? So in a utopian alt, what will happen is that the alternative described will be totally theoretical, and it will require, honestly, in my opinion, a degree of fiat power that the negative just doesn't really have in public forum. What do I mean by this? When you have an alternative, let's say that we're looking at the cap K. This is a classic K. And the affirmative is running a position that says that if we pass the policy, it'll improve the economy and reduce poverty. Okay? And the neg runs a cap K that says that this is a bad thing because any positions that that reinforce capitalism or endorse capitalism, capitalist ideals are inherently flawed and perpetuate this mass evil across the world. Now, if you wanted to have a utopian alt to capitalism, you would say a vote for the negative represents an endorsement of a global socialist revolution that overthrows all of capitalism. So basically the idea is if our critique convinces you that that not engaging in any of these capitalist structures and then endorsing a complete revolution is a preferable alternative in terms of what to vote for, then you should vote for our critique. That's what a utopian alt looks like. So to model what the reject alt looks like, this is the more common version. The reject version is just a basic delineation between what the two teams stands for, and it isolates a attribute that is unique to the team that you're debating against, and it then gives a reason to reject that team for it. And it gives a reason for why that is good for debate, good for discourse, whatever it might be. All right, so those are the two types of alts. And one other thing to remember is that, alts come in all shapes and sizes, but generally speaking, they will fall under one of these two types. They may or may not use the actual words like reject, but essentially that'll be what's being laid out. So now let's talk about when to run critiques if you are in the business of making these arguments to win rounds. So obviously, tech judges are most reliable to evaluate critical debates. We're going to get more into this because this just seems really obvious on the surface. But there's actually a lot to know in terms of like what tech judges you should feel comfortable running critiques in front of. So when you're looking at a paradigm, right, and a tech judge is writing about, oh, like I like flow, I do all these different things, and then I'm open to critiques and theory as well, and then they move on. In my opinion, that usually indicates a lack of super high level confident understanding of the critical debate or the theory debate or what have you. The reason I say this is that nobody, especially if you're a flow judge, wants to be the hack that's just going to never listen to any sort of critical argument. But at the same time, particularly for those people that come from a public forum background or a traditional debate background, they won't, well, I guess traditional debaters from like policy or LD might understand it pretty well, but the vast majority of people that come from a public forum background are not really going to understand the K debate very well at all, unfortunately. So if their paradigms sound more like, oh yeah, I'm open to it, you should tread carefully. An ideal scenario is one in which you gather information that indicates that they are highly knowledgeable about critiques. So if they have substantial experience, especially doing circuit policy and or Lincoln Douglas debate, or they're using some amount of jargon about the K debate or the theory debate. So on the theory debate, one thing would be talking about like if they default to competing interps. On the K debate, some people are like, I think links of omission are dumb, and these are concepts that are a lot more advanced and that I hope to get into at some point in the future. But if you see concepts that are more advanced being discussed in the paradigm as it pertains to theory and K debate, that is kind of the green light, right? That means that you've got a judge that isn't going to make some huge misunderstanding. Because when you start to make these arguments to tech judges that say they're open to the argument, it gets a little dicey because you don't know if that judge has any idea what's going on. You don't know if that tech judge just heard about the idea of uh, of a critique from her friend in like Nebraska and is like, oh, that sounds cool, but has zero clue how to actually evaluate it. And since we're in PF, that comprises a fair share of judges, unfortunately. And I haven't encountered that several times myself. So if your goal is number one, first and foremost, competitive success, which I assume for most of you it is, then I would advise you to be careful about which judges you run critical arguments in front of. Now, we'll talk about the exceptions to that in a second, but again, you should look for a policy/LD background. These formats understand critical debate much, much, much better than we do here in PF, and they've explored it on a much deeper level. So whenever you get a policy or an LD judge, generally speaking, unless they come from like a super traditional circuit or have like paradigms where they're like, I love topicality, or they seem super substance oriented and not open-minded to other arguments, generally it's a good move if you want to run the critique to run it in front of those judges if you're going to run it in front of anyone. However, they will have higher standards, which a lot of the time aren't met in PF. They come from formats where speech times are a lot longer than ours are, which means that critiques are explored in substantially more depth in these other formats than they're explored in public forum. And what that means is that you will need to, first of all, adapt your critique in such a way where you're dealing with things in an efficient enough manner, but can still get into similar depth as people get into in these other formats. Second of all, you need to make it more accessible than it is in these other formats because the nature and structure of our format has trained the minds of judges to only accept critiques that are, in a way, spoon-fed to them and explained in very simple ways. And then the other thing is that you need, if you're going to come with the critique, you need to come correct. You need to have your act together. You need to know how to win the critique. And you don't need to have like completed a PhD dissertation on like critical arguments or anything, but you at least need to have a solid grasp of the fundamentals. Because if you don't, no one will be a harsher critic than the annoyed policy or LD judge that's listening to this critique and they're like, oh my God, I've heard this run 50 times in my format and you're just butchering it. Especially if they have some personal connection with the material of the critique. They'll be very harsh a lot of the time in my experience. So keep those things in mind. So best scenario is with the policy or LD judge, but you need to know your stuff a bit if you want to run it in front of those types of judges. Not to be intimidating, you should still try it, right? There's only one way to improve. No one's going to be a master the first time, but have that in the back of your mind because that's the truth. That's how judges will respond some of the time. So let's talk a little bit more about when to run these arguments because truly when to run critiques is a very important question. People mess this up all the time and incorrect judge selection for when to run is a big problem. And you can get away with running these critiques in front of judges that aren't as technical. You can. However, first of all, it's very risky. Second of all, you need to change your approach for maximum competitive success. Firstly, you need to appeal to emotion. Critiques are oftentimes very personal arguments. They're identity-based. They can be pretty sensitive topics. This means you need to handle them with extreme care and with authenticity and not in a commodification-y way. But it also means that you have a lot of room to appeal to emotion. Critiques let you talk a lot about real-world, everyday oppression, which is one of the cool things about the argument. And one of the things that make them respectable and useful in debate. This means that you can tell stories that might not be told otherwise on an otherwise a dry topic about percentages of economic growth and what have you. So appeals to emotion included in critiques that you're trying to appeal to a broader audience are a great idea. Additionally, you should very clearly warrant why this critique means that you affirm or negate. This is something that is oftentimes absent in critiques that are written up in Lincoln Douglas and policy. There's not a super clear role of the ballot where it's like, if you believe that Orientalism is such a bad thing, the affirmative has presented an Orientalist case in XYZ way, you need to reject this and vote negative if you would like to see a community that evolves in ZYX way. And that sort of clear, simple warranting is super critical if you want to win with critiques with a broader range of judges. And it can't be dense, it can't be hyper technical stuff. It'll go straight over their heads. And a little bit of framing with the critique that doesn't make it sound like a weird argument, right? So you're not starting in front of a lay judge being like, it's going to be too off. Good luck. You're going to lose immediately. What you should make it sound like is, our first contention is systematic oppression or something like that, where you're making it seem like as normal and as digestible of a debate argument as you possibly can. You should also justify why your K should be considered a core part of the debate. This one means that you don't just want to run into some weird argument like some like Jesus K or something without justifying why it's so pertinent to the debate. This usually will happen in an earlier part of your constructive. And what I mean by justifying why it's a core part of the debate is you need to explain why the critique that you're presenting is in fact something that is super relevant to the topic. So on the Orientalism topic, this would be a great idea on a Middle East topic, right? You can have a card at the top that says that one of the most fundamental questions when we are trying to address a foreign policy topic about the Middle East is dealing with the issue of how race and identity interplays with our substantive understanding of foreign policy. So now you've created a justification for why this isn't some weird, dumb argument. This is an actual factor at play as we all do our best to understand this topic. Okay, so now let's talk about how to actually respond to some of this stuff. So first off, we're going to talk about how to engage the link, which is the top part of the critique. And I'll probably have some follow-up courses pretty soon that go a lot more in depth on how to respond to the critique. I might actually try to push one of those out either this week or next week. So stay tuned for that. That'll be on our Academy, which is DebateDrills. You can see the little Academy tab at the top. There's a bunch of awesome videos that you can watch there. But how do you engage links? Several ways. First, question them analytically. It's not just contentions that you can come up with really smart analytics to. It's also critiques. Most common mistake I see teams make when they get hit with critiques is they freak out and they're like, I don't know how to answer this. It's just an argument. Answer it like you would answer an argument. And arguments have logical holes. Arguments have inconsistencies. Arguments have room for theoreticals about how the world would be preferable if you didn't say this, but instead took this position. So question it in any analytical way you can, as long as you're not minimizing the suffering or trivializing the oppression that they discuss in the impact. That is a very dumb thing to do because it'll lose you the sympathy of the judge, and it also can be somewhat offensive. And you want to stay away from denying that the impact of, say, Orientalism or anti-Asian racism exists, because not only would that be extremely stupid, it'll probably lose you the round. So don't do that. What you should do is question whether or not you actually promote that idea. You should also question whether or not their argument does anything to resolve that idea, et cetera, et cetera. These are all strong ways to analytically question the argument being brought in front of you without being offensive. Being offensive is one of the dumbest possible things you can do in response to a critique, and yet it is one of the most common things that teams wind up doing, not because they're evil people or anything, but because you're all high schoolers and this is a place where we all make mistakes, and particularly with kids that just don't know how to respond to critiques, they'll just try to find any statement to falsify that has been made in the critique. There are certain statements you don't want to try to falsify. Instead, what you want to do is you want to spot holes in the link chain that are reasonable and can be exploited. You should also ask, do they link to, right? Do they bite the link into their own critique? So a critique will take a very rigid, principled position on an issue. It, a lot of the time, is very difficult to be principally consistent with your advocacy in terms of a critique. So, for example, a performative contradiction. This is a concept where the team reading the critique bites their own link into the critique. So when I say that, I mean that let's say that the team is running a security K. They're running a security critique, and again, like we explained earlier, this is a critique in which you you imagine that every conflict scenario is basically just fake. um, if you say that, and then also say that modeling out these conflict scenarios and talking about how, um, China and the U.S. are like basically talking about how they're going to go to war makes that war more likely, and then you respond to your opponent's case that said these things with turns that say, "Oh no, actually, voting for you guys will make that war more likely." You have just committed a performative contradiction. Why? Because you did the thing you told them not to do on principle. That is, model a conflict scenario without knowing 100% or not whether it would actually come to fruition. There's a lot of different examples of this on the critical debate, and it can also not necessarily be super blatant. This is a very debatable subject, whether or not something is a perf con. All right. So next, let's talk about engaging impacts. Several relevant bits of information here. I'm actually going to go sort of like just over several possible ways you can engage impacts. And by the way, this is a totally non-exhaustive list of how to engage critiques. It's just a bunch of really good ways to do it because a lot of teams just don't know how. So one way to engage impacts is hollow hope. Critiquers will 9 times out of 10 purport to solve a problem that is 10 times larger and more complex than they are actually able to solve. So that might be racism in the United States. That might be, Orientalism or gender like language or whatever it might be, right? So the critiquer will never solve a meaningful portion of their impact at all, right? It's not unique. Now, a smart critiquer knows this. This isn't a secret. However, you can use the hollow hope argument to exploit this fact. So what you can point out is the obvious. You can say, okay, look, this impact exists across 20 different industries and organizations and every country in the world. It's been existing for centuries. We're never going to be able to completely solve this problem. At best, we can mitigate it, which we want to do. However, the way that they're framing this argument acts as though endorsing them will do anything at all to solve this problem. However, it does literally nothing. And that's where you get to the offensive portion of this, which is where you can say that, hey, doing nothing at all about this issue and then claiming that you did something, claiming that you took a meaningful step against racism by voting for a critique in a debate round, creates complacency. It means that you're patting yourself on the back for doing nothing. And when you pat yourself on the back for doing nothing, that makes you more comfortable with doing nothing. And on some level, it might trade off with your perceived need to take tangible action in the future, like going to a protest, going out to vote for particular candidates, et cetera, et cetera. That's how you make a hollow hope argument. Part 2 of engaging impacts. Ask a few questions. First, ask, do your impacts trigger theirs? This is one of my favorite ways to respond to critiques because the impacts of critiques are heavily connected with tangible societal factors. So for example, we went up against a critique, I believe it was finals of the Blake round robin. And the critique said something along the lines of, I believe it was violence against gay people in Venezuela triggered by sanctions. Uh, and then there was another argument that was like how sanctions were a form of imperialism where the U.S. punished its economic enemies and it was targeted against the working class, yada, yada, yada. What we said is our contention says that the alternative to sanctions is a military invasion of Venezuela. That's going to trigger the same impacts of colonialism and hurting the LGBT community and doing all of those things, which means that if you want to, you know, vote in the interest of the stakeholder, you need to vote for us. The next thing you need to do is probably some link wang that explains why my military invasion is a lot worse for relevant stakeholders than just the sanctions would be. And there's a lot of reasons as to why that might be the case. Another example of this is, let's say you're just running a stock like recession argument, you know, and it's just like, oh, the economy is gonna get really bad, and then the team hits you with something about inequality or racism or whatever. It's a well-known fact that economic decline is one of the biggest drivers of populism and racism. It gets down to human psychology, where there's perceived scarcity, people make irrational connections about competition against other groups that aren't them, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of room to essentially just make prereq analysis like you would on a conventional weighing debate, much like. You also want to question their theory. Vast majority of critiques, especially well-run ones, will be rooted in some sort of theory. Afro-pessimism is a much discussed, deep, substantive academic theory. So is Orientalism. There have been many papers written by many respectable professors and researchers on these subjects. However, every theory has a counter theory, for lack of a better word. Every theory, like Orientalism, like whatever, has been critiqued itself and has people that disagree with it and publish materials that are like, hey, you know, this thesis of this argument is totally wrong, and this thesis of this argument is totally wrong. What you can do to respond to these arguments is cut the cards of those who disagree with the theory and then use those to respond to the theory. This is one of the best ways possible to respond to critiques. The reason, twofold. First, it really helps to have evidence rather than just analytics. That's because you're at a disadvantage if the other team is the only one with evidence. Second of all, it will massively increase the substantive level of your engagement. Not only will it make for a much better debate when you're not just, just talking basically, but you're actually citing experts who a lot of the time will make better arguments than you will and will phrase them better and will think of things you didn't think of. And that'll expand your understanding of these arguments as well and make it a lot more likely that you're able to have excellent debates on these topics in the future. So question their theory. The caveat to this is that it's not really doable mid-round. So you would need to have some sort of intel on what the critique was that they're running or common critiques being run at the tournament, and then research accordingly. Right. So next thing is engaging the role of the ballot, which is the last part besides the alt, which is sort of part of it, that we're going to go through for responding to the critiques. So one type of role of ballot that's super common is discourse role of the ballot, right? So the argument here is that, okay, we said something that was really important in our critique. It's so great that we've been saying this thing. You should vote for us so that we can continue to say this thing into late out rounds and beyond and whatever. A lot of critiques that are run with this discourse role of the ballot can be great. But this is also like, this was where policy debate was like decades ago. Most other formats have sort of evolved to a more nuanced conception of a role of the ballot. This is still one of the more common ones in PF. I think it's probably because it's quite simple. And with that comes a set of vulnerabilities and reasons why it's like not really the greatest role of the ballot. So one of which is speaking for others. So what you're really doing, especially if you're not yourself a member of the group, like who you're discussing, is you're asking for a pat on the back for just sort of talking about suffering of some other group, which is inherently problematic for a lot of reasons, not least of which is that who knows if you're going to accurately represent the stories you've been told. And in addition, if you're of a dominant identity, you might be, taking up space in the discussion that could have been occupied by someone who doesn't need a pat on the back or a ballot to talk about an issue. The next thing that you should do for a discourse rule about is you should question the solvency here. So the thesis of a lot of these arguments is that, hey, if we have people in outrounds talking about, like, discrimination against this group and that group, surely that will lead to some, tangible reduction in bigoted sentiment. Unfortunately, it is not that simple. And as we have seen a huge rise in critical argumentation and policy in Lincoln Douglas, we still see a lot of the same exact problems with bigotry. Every ism still exists in those formats of debate. And the reason for this is that the inclusion of a marginalized voice in a space does not mean or prove that actions are then being taken by all or a majority of the members of that space to actually solve the problem, because the limit of the discussion being presented is just to win the one debate round. It does not at all mean that there is the larger discussion and overhaul of the practices and people that are making the environment an unwelcoming one for those who have struggled with oppression, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea that, like, just talking about an issue in a debate round will solve the issue in the debate space there is a lot to unpack there, and it is certainly quite debatable. The next one is commodification. So naturally, when you have a roll of the ballot where it's literally just like, okay, I am talking about this problem facing this community, give me a ballot. This incentivizes people who don't care about this community or this problem whatsoever to just cynically make the argument if they don't believe it, if they don't care about it, etc., just for the sake of winning a ballot, because they think, oh, this is a cool, tricky debate argument. When this happens, you basically poison the well, because you bring in a lot of people who will misrepresent and change the narrative in ways that are super unproductive to the discussion. So now it's not like we're all aligned against one negative thing. It's like now the group talking about this issue has internally fragmented, because you have people that want to commodify the issue. So that's one of my favorite responses to the roll of the ballot. You don't want to accuse the team running the argument of commodification, because then that's just like an ad hominem attack, right? For all you know, they are personally affected and care deeply about this issue. So it doesn't make sense to accuse the team of commodifying it ever, right? You always want to treat teams running all arguments with respect, especially sensitive ones like critiques. So engaging rolls of the ballot, part 2. Responding to alts. You want to do two things. So again, the alternative is what you do instead of affirming or negating if someone's running a KF. But that's what the alt is. So you do two things to respond to the alt. The first is that you want to permit. You want to explain why you can do both, vote for us, and also endorse the alt of the critique. So let's talk about a fem IRK. The idea is that every international institution was founded and created on the exclusion of women, which leads to bias and terrible outcomes, and that all of these need to be shut down. And the alt is to reject all of these, reject the sexism in all of these institutions, etc. So what you could do as the AF on, again, this would be critiquing the United Nations Security Council, which was the subject of a topic a couple of years back. What you could do on the AF is say, it is not mutually exclusive to reject sexism in international relations and argue for a massive reform, and also vote for India to join the Security Council, which is the resolution. One possible reason why is that India will support reforms themselves to get more women in the council. And then you get into the next thing you need to do, which is explain why the perm is preferable. So oftentimes taking a substantive policy action is a lot better than just taking some moralistic stance to just like tear down an institution and never engage with it again. A lot of the time, especially when it comes to international institutions, you want to fix them, not nix them. You know, if they're bad, you want to like patch them up, because if you just get rid of them, then first of all, you'll still need to create something new in its place, and so then you'll just recreate all the same problems. So part 3, you can engage roll of the ballot with theory. This is one of my personal favorite ways to engage roll of the ballot, in addition with commodification. And this is a major logical fallacy that I think a lot of critiques suffer from. So what you want to say is, in response to their roll of the ballot, you should say that, okay, let's say the role of the ballot is whoever best questions Orientalism should win the debate. What you should say is, if this was the universal role of the ballot for public forum debate, how would this affect fairness in education? The answer is that it would completely destroy them, because every debate would literally just be about Orientalism. And so that means the activity would not function whatsoever, which is a prerequisite to anyone learning that Orientalism is a bad thing. So what you really need to defend is why you should be able to universalize role of the ballot, and that's where a more advanced debate here will come down to. But I think this is a really smart way to respond to critiques if you know how to do it right. All right, so now let's get into the Q&A. But first, as you all probably have realized, this format is becoming immensely more technical. When I was a freshman, nobody ran critiques. Nobody did it. Then one team, my sophomore year, this team from Altamont, ran this critique at the TOC, and wasn't exactly wasn't exactly a masterpiece what they ran. Like, it was just kind of the primitive discourse framing type stuff, but it was really cool because they were the first ones that did it. And then junior year came and there were teams running it at the TOC, and senior year came and now people are running these arguments all the time. And then this last year, the team that won the TOC was running a critique. So the direction of at least tech debates in this format is going towards critiques and progressive argumentation. And that has been the natural march of time of every single debate format in history. So once upon a time, every other format you've ever heard of, policy, Lincoln Douglas, blah, 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 was super, super traditional. Okay? And make no mistake, traditional skills will always be somewhat important in public forum because you have lay judges. But what we do at debate drills in Lincoln Douglas debate, which understands critiques 10 times more than we do in PF, we're merging the skills and expertise of the best LD coaches in the country who over the last several years have had kids in TOC finals back to back to back years. So nobody understands this better than they do. We're merging their expertise with the expertise of some of the best technical debaters in public forum. And we are going to be teaching people all about how to match these skills, how to utilize them, because this is an onion with 10 different layers. So if you want to work with us to learn a lot more about these critiques, we offer fall and summer classes. Now, we're offering late registration for them, but they just started this last week. I would super encourage you to look into those if you think that might be of interest. We also offer tutoring. And last but certainly not least, our club team for the season. Our goal here is to create the biggest and best prep group ever in public forum, and also offer a bunch of practices and improvement. Basically, we'll give to everyone what I got at Blake, which is a great massive infrastructure, but you don't have to be lucky enough to just happen to go to a great private school to get it. So this will sort of show you exactly what we offer on this club team. As you can see, it's a whole lot of stuff. It's everything you need to have a massively successful career and have all the resources required. And most of all, as you'll soon see coming this season, we're going to be pioneering some strategies that are going to be very new in public forum debate and are going to be super tough to respond to. So I would encourage you to hop on board. If you're interested, you can schedule a free chat with me. If you go to debatedrills.com, you hit the little services, then the first thing you see is PF services. You hit that, and then there's a button right there where you can schedule a call with me and the leadership if you think you might be interested in applying for the club team. We don't accept everyone, but if you think you might be interested in applying, we totally welcome you to. So yeah, thanks for watching. I hope you all found this educational, and critiques there's a lot to talk about. We certainly weren't able to cover all of it in this hour-long slot, but drop some questions in the chat. I'll give you all a minute to ask me those questions, fill the chat up with some of them. I'm going to run to my fridge and grab something to drink because my mouth is super dry. I'll be right back. In the meantime, write some questions, type them in the chat, and then we'll get straight to the Q&A. So we'll start with Varshith. He says, can you critique the debate space as a whole, or is it just those three? Or would that just be a theory shell? Yes, you can critique the debate space as a whole. You certainly can do that. You're right. That is sort of a fourth type of critique in a way that might be critiquing a topic, because what you would need to justify is why shouldn't we talk about the topic and why should we just talk about the debate space. But yeah, you absolutely can critique the debate space as a whole. People do it all the time that are very talented. Would that just be a theory shell? Not necessarily. Not necessarily. There was a really interesting anti-blackness critique that I think North Broward ran like a year or two ago at a PF tournament that was like PF owes a like debt to black debaters, blah blah blah. And it was pretty good, and that was not a theory shell, and that was pretty much just critiquing the entire PF debate space as a whole. So yeah, I think they did pretty well with it too, if I remember correctly. Josh says, how do we run commodification if we don't accuse our opponents of doing it? Very good question. What you want to do is you want to say, okay, my opponents have this discourse-based role of the ballot. That's what they're asking you to accept. Our argument is that if you let discourse-based roles of the ballot go unchecked, what will happen is you will get commodification, you'll get appropriation, etc., for all the reasons I explained in the future. We're not saying that they themselves are being dishonest. We're saying that if you don't reject this type of role of the ballot right now, that discourse will be generated in the future, and it will become a net harm to the community's ability to discuss and understand these sensitive topics in an authentic way. So that's how you make that distinction. You say that it's about preventing the discourse in the future from actually getting worse. So it's a sort of like a direct turn on the premise of the discourse getting better. Aryan says, how do you explain why perms are preferable again? So what you want to do is you want to give an explanation for what you get tangibly by doing the resolution and the alt that you wouldn't get from just doing the alt. So the resolution, for example, would allow you to pass some sort of policy, right? Maybe that policy improves the economy that can then go to like help minorities do something, or it prevents a war, which would be really harmful for women, et cetera, et cetera. That's what you do. You take the resolution and you say, hey, we can solve this alt better because we have the power to make a tangible change. And they're just being symbolic, essentially. Bill says, what is the best way to learn as many Ks as possible? I would say there's a whole lot of free and open source resources online that talk about like every major source, like every major critique. There's a ton of stuff out there, like blogs and stuff that go in depth on like AfroPest, CapKs, all the major classic critiques that people run. In the LD and policy space, there's a crap ton of open source stuff out there. So explore that. Keep in mind that a lot of that will be sort of optimized for those other formats, but certainly you can learn a whole lot about these critiques. Josh says, what's the difference between theory and critiques? Another great question. So critiques have a role of the ballot. They explain why, they essentially define what the ballot is supposed to do. A theory argument is about what the rules of debate should be, right? Critique is sort of about like the language that we all use and the way that we understand ourselves and our discussions in debate. Theory is more about what should the rules be in terms of how we go about facilitating and engaging within that discussion, which is why theory comes down to fairness and education, and critiques don't really come down to those two critical issues. Moon Young says, how do we question solvency again? So you can do, and I assume that this pertains to the point about the the discourse-based role of the ballot. So you want to question solvency by coming up with a logical reason as to why just talking about this issue in the debate space does not mean that there will necessarily be change. One good reason for this is that discourse alone is incredibly easy to ignore because it's just high schoolers talking about something. What needs to happen is large-scale tangible action taken particularly by the adults and the administrators in the community, and maybe even retraining that costs time and resources and all of these different things that are certainly not going to happen because somebody talked about something for 30 minutes in a debate round. So that's what you need to do. You need to come up with an affirmative reason why discourse is unlikely to produce results. William says, can you re-explain how the commodification argument works again? Yes, I can. So the commodification argument says that, okay, I guess I'll just start by briefly re-explaining the discourse role of the ballot. So the discourse role of the ballot says that, okay, I made this argument and it's really important and it's about gay people or race or whatever it might be. And I think it's so important that other people hear this message that you should vote for me so that I can keep winning rounds and then more people can hear me talk about it, basically. The commodification argument is a response to this argument that says that just rewarding people for talking about an issue incentivizes people who don't even care about that issue to essentially just appropriate that concern as a cynical, cheap way to win rounds and out-tech other teams. So that's the commodification argument in a nutshell. Patrick says, thoughts on K's on the affirmative/critical affirmatives. Would you respond the same way? Yeah, KFs and PF are kind of weird. I think that the problem is that it's difficult to derive like some sort of inherent net benefit from negating the resolution. I would respond in functionally the same way. I don't think it really changes too much in terms of how it plays out in PF. I would just basically say, like, first, we can still make arguments about like why our impacts trigger the same impacts of the critique, because like they're still disad, so not doing the resolution still like triggers them. The second thing is that I think that there's a really good there's a lot of ground for theory in public forum for why KFs like shouldn't necessarily be accepted. PF in the like literal NSDA handbook has a lot more stuff pertaining to topicality built into it. A lot of, I mean, I think it explicitly bans like a plan, for example. I think that you can make an argument that the alt section of a critique resembles a plan and should therefore be thrown out on face. And you can use that to respond to a KF. So yeah, that's how I would respond. Basically the same, but maybe I'd also make some argument about, hey, you made the F or you made the alt into a plan or something. All right. Any other questions? All right. Moon Young says, what would be the best way to question their theory when you don't have evidence? So it's difficult to question their theory when you don't have evidence unless you can come up with logical reasons why that theory might be incorrect. So one great logical reason on the security K, which is a type of theory, securitization is the name of the theory. That again is basically and it overlaps a lot with the threat K, threat construction. But one way you can analytically respond to that theory is by saying that, hey, these threats are real, right? These conflict scenarios, these wars that we talk about, they're real threats that we have to care about. And if we don't care about them, the world could end. So, I mean, let's talk about nuclear war. Way back when, I believe it was around the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a Russian lieutenant who was using a radar system and who saw a flock of birds flying, and like the radar system misfired, and it told him that there was a barrage of US nuclear weapons that were coming towards Russia. And so if he had made the decision to alert command and say, we are under attack, the nuclear war has begun, none of us would be speaking here right now because the world would have ended in a thermonuclear war. He didn't do that. He made the unilateral decision to just trust that the system was misfiring and that nobody was actually nuking anybody. And that's one example of like, the threats are real, you know, they're not like, maybe they're not the most probable thing. Like maybe they're not as probable as like a 1% increase in economic growth, but they can certainly still happen. And if we don't act like they can ever happen, then we might find ourselves walking into another Cuban Missile Crisis. And then, you know, maybe we won't be so lucky next time. All right. Any other questions? All right, doesn't look like it. So thanks so much, everyone, for stopping by. If you want to work with me some more this summer in maybe a small group session where we can tailor everything specifically to what you need, shoot me a message on Slack. We'd love to work with you. And yeah, until next time, there will probably be another one of these seminars coming up next week, and we will keep you posted. So as always, thank you all so much for coming, and I'll see you soon. Peace.